Hi everybody, it's Ryan here, and today we're going to be looking at price elasticity of supply. Alright, to start off with some definitions. So price elasticity of supply, because it is a type of elasticity, it is, like the other elasticities that we've looked at, a measurement of responsiveness. And because it's price elasticity of supply, the variables that we're interested in, it's the responsiveness of quantity supplied following a change in the price for that product. So really what we're saying here is that if the price of the product changes, how quickly and how much do suppliers react to that price change and therefore change the amount that they're supplying. We'll also want to be able to put it into mathematical notation. So price elasticity of supply is the percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. Remember, this is very similar to the other elasticity formulas. Again, it's the queen rules over the people. The only really difference between this and price elasticity of demand is we've changed quantity demanded for quantity supplied. And of course, you can always put this into a shorthand by saying that PES is equal to percentage delta QS over percentage delta P, which just means the same thing that we've looked at before, percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. Right, so as a quick exercise, you can pause the video and have a look at this image here. It shows several different products, and the question is, following a change in price, which of these will have the greatest reaction in terms of quantity supplied? So so pause the video, take a few, and then just have a think about this, and then I'll review what I think the answers are. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to do that. I'm just going to go through some of the answers that I think would be reasonable. And this is by no means 100% correct or incorrect. This is just sort of what I'm thinking at the minute. And I'll also go through a little bit about what sort of assumptions that I'm making here. And I think I'm going to try to sort of put this into terms of like, I think I'm going to sort of go from like, the smallest rise in supply to the largest rise of supply. So the first one is, it's the Mona Lisa, right? There's one of them in the world. And so therefore it doesn't really matter what the price is. There's just the one. And so therefore I think that it's not really going to matter what the price is. It's just like there's one of them. So that one's going to be sort of here. That's got the really small rise in supply, the Mona Lisa. Looking through the other parts of this, okay, I think the next one's probably going to be coffee beans. In fact, sorry if you couldn't see that. These are coffee beans. This is what coffee beans look like when they're being grown, and they're harvested and they're roasted and they turn into coffee beans here. And I'm thinking that coffee beans are also going to be fairly difficult to change in terms of their quantity supplied. Because the price could rise for coffee. It's a commodity on global markets. But that's not going to mean you're going to be able to grow more coffee beans all of a sudden. It's an agricultural product. It takes time to grow and to harvest. And so therefore, I think that we're going to say that, there might be some small rise, but by and large, whatever's there is already there. And so therefore, you're not going to be able to get much more just because the price of it's gone up. The next one I'm going to say is probably going to be, houses. So this is like, what this is sort of like a housing estate. That I suppose that's if you're building houses. If you're building houses, then I suppose it's going to be sort of over here, sort of like on the small rise in supply, just because houses, I think, take a bit of time to build. Of course, if you weren't talking about building houses, if you're just thinking about the number of houses on the market, because people wanted to sell them, they're already existing houses that people just think they might want to sell, then actually I think then it might go over here, right? So it depends on your assumptions for that one. I think building houses is going to be, relatively, unresponsive, but just houses that are generally there, it's like, yeah, I'm sure people will probably want to sell them if the price goes up. Let's see the next one. I'm going to say the next one's probably going to be maybe like this. Like this, I'm thinking it's like actually a wind turbine, like actually building the wind turbines. It's an expensive thing to build. You've got to get planning permission, and you've got to install it. So I think that if the price of wind turbines went up, then it would be harder to suddenly produce more of them. And so therefore I'm going to say that it's going to be sort of like a medium rise in supply. Followed next, I think, by probably, bus journeys, right? If all of a sudden the price of bus journeys were higher, you might be able to get more bus companies to offer these journeys, and it would be relatively easy, I suppose, to get more buses out there in the fleet, but probably not. You still have to purchase the buses and establish the routes. That might take some time. The next ones I'm going to think are going to be like these ones: Primark clothes and Mars bars. I think they sort of go together in my head, and they're going to be sort of over here in terms of like getting on like sort of the bigger rise in supply, because they're produced goods. They're produced in a factory. Same thing with the iPhone. I think iPhone's sort of going to be over here somewhere as well, where it's like if you suddenly have a higher price for these things, there's not very much of a constraint in producing more of them, especially like Mars bars. It's just the ingredients. Just probably run the factory a bit more, and so therefore you'll be able to produce more of these things. And so yeah, I think that those are going to be quite responsive to price. This one here is gold bullion. And so if it's gold bullion, that means it's held in a bank somewhere. And if the price of it goes up, I think more people are going to offer it onto the market because it's just there. And the only reason why it's there is because people are holding on to it as an investment. And so therefore, if you suddenly see a big rise in the price of it, I'm imagining that people are going to say, right, it's time to cash in. I want to cash in on my gold bullion. And so therefore we're going to see a really big rise in supply. Now, the main thing that I think, and I think that I want to really focus on this one, is that something like iTunes downloads. Now that's going to be the biggest rise in supply. And I think the reason for that is because if the price of these things goes up, it's like, well, sure, we want to sell more of them. Is it hard to produce any more of them? And no, it's not. All you've got to do is just let your users download more of the songs. So I think that's the kind of thing where it's like, if the price goes up, you're going to see lots more of that on the market. And that's kind of what we're trying to establish here. We're trying to establish what determines the price elasticity of supply. So that's what we're going to be talking about now. And I think this is sort of for notes. This is the kind of thing that you'll want to have down somewhere that you can just sort of, look at, think about, but also try to internalize to say, well, what does affect PES? And these are the factors that I think are going to be on the short list. Number one, the per unit or marginal cost of the product. What this means is if the marginal cost is constant, because maybe it's a product that doesn't experience diminishing returns to the variable factor of production, which means you can just keep producing more and more and more, like the iTunes downloads. This means that it's going to be fairly easy to produce more of these things, right? So therefore, it's going to be much easier to produce. So the quantity supplied will be more responsive, more elastic, because yeah, the price goes up and the companies can just produce more of them. I put here sort of two examples. Is like toothpicks. Toothpicks has I'd say a fairly low marginal cost of production, right? It's like a little piece of wood that you just gotta break up and sort of, I don't know, sort of smooth into a point. And so therefore, if the price of it goes up, it's not gonna be that much harder to make more of them. Whereas Picasso paintings, it's sort of like one of a kind. It's like marginal cost is infinite, so therefore there's only one of them. So therefore, it's not very responsive to changes in price. The next one I think is really important. It's time horizon. Is to say that the amount of time that you're given to consider how long it is you're going to be able to see the change between the price and the quantity supplied, the more elastic it's going to be. So like with coffee beans, we might say, well, the price of them has gone up. So therefore, this year, what's the quantity supplied like? Well, it's quite fixed. It's not really that responsive. But if you give it a, say, 5-year period, well, then that gives farmers the chance to plant more coffee beans. They have bigger crops in the next few years, and so therefore it will be more responsive as time goes on. So what we mean by time horizon is just that if you have a longer time to consider, you'll have more time for the quantity supplied to respond, and so therefore it will be more elastic, it will be more responsive the longer that you have in your time horizon. The next is how much it demands from its input markets. So what this means is that if the product is really demanding of its input markets. So if it really requires a lot of of inputs to produce the thing, then it might be quite inelastic. It might be quite unresponsive to changes in price because it's going to be very difficult to get those things. But if it doesn't demand very much of its input markets, if it's only a very small amount, then it's going to be more responsive and more elastic. And so I'm using toothpicks again here. So toothpicks don't really demand very much from their input markets, right? You need wood, right? So you get some wood, you break it up, sharpen it into points. There's plenty of wood around the world, right? You can get that anywhere. And so if suddenly toothpicks were really in really high demand and you wanted to produce more of them, you just get some wood, work the process, and then you make more of them. And it's not like you're taking up most of the wood market. Whereas something like automobiles, automobiles are more complicated and they take up more of their input markets. So like the steel, the components that go into making cars, it's probably a bit harder to get your hands on that. And of course, if you're increasing all car production, cars probably take up a quite large percentage of global steel markets, and so therefore it might be a little less responsive. So the summary of that is to say the more that it takes from the input market, the less responsive, the more inelastic it's going to be. The less it takes from its input markets, the more elastic or the more responsive it's going to be. Next one is the scope or the geographic scope of the market. So what that means is that if you consider a small geographic scope, if you say, okay, we have increased the price of coffee, or we've increased the price of clothes and Primark products, are we going to be able to easily increase our quantity supplied? And if you look at a narrow scope, which is to say quite locally, then there's only going to be a limit. There's only so much of the supply that's there at any one time. So if you increase the quantity, if you increase the price, there's only so much quantity supply that you can actually increase. But if you then widen your scope to a wider geographical scope and you consider maybe, say, the world or the entire country, then you'll be able to have more quantity supplied. So the narrower the geographic scope, the more inelastic it's going to be. Whereas the wider the geographic scope, therefore the more elastic your PES is going to be. Spare production capacity. Now what this refers to is what percentage of your factory is already utilized in actually making the products that you're making. And if you're already running at pretty much full capacity, if you're using all your machines and workers fully, then you're not going to be able to respond very much to changes in price, and so therefore it will be more inelastic. Say with a car factory, right? If the car factory is completely running at its full capacity, it can't make any more cars. If the price of those cars goes up, there's not much they can do about it. Therefore, it's going to be inelastic or unresponsive. If the car factory were running at say half capacity, and the price of the car suddenly went up, it'd be much easier for the company to increase production. So therefore, it would be more elastic in its price elasticity of supply. Next is ease of factor substitutability or factor mobility. Factor substitutability we saw before when we were talking about PPFs, and it refers to how easy is it to have factors which can substitute for each other. So if you've got two different workers and they're both producing two different goods, can both producers produce both goods, or which would be more, that's a higher degree of substitutability, or are they specialized and they can only really produce one good or the other, and that would be a low degree of factor substitutability. If you have high factor substitutability, that makes it easier to produce more goods, and so therefore the price elasticity of supply would be more elastic if you had greater factor substitutability, because you could say, right, we need to produce more goods, so therefore let's shift some of the factors that used to be producing something else into this good that's now increased in price, and so therefore we're going to increase our quantity supplied for that good. And factor mobility we haven't really seen before, but what it refers to is how easy is it to get the factors of production that you need in order to produce that product. The easiest thing to think about with this would probably be labor mobility of labor. And that's going to be determined by how easy it is for your workforce to maybe get to your place of work or to move to your place of work if you needed them to. And so the higher the labor factor or the factor mobility is, the easier it is for people to move, the more elastic your product is going to be. Because if the price increases for your product, you're going to be able to get more workers to the factory. You're going to be able to get more workers to move to your area to produce this good. And so therefore you're going to be able to be responsive to those price changes and increase your quantity supplied, which would make therefore a product which is elastic. And the last one is the stocks of finished products and components. If you've got lots of stock and you've got things that are just sat around, then obviously that means that it's going to be more elastic, because if the price goes up, you don't have to actually physically make the goods. You can just take your stock and sell that. And of course, if you don't have the finished products or the components, and you don't have them to hand, if the price of the thing goes up, then it will be more difficult to do that. A bit of advice that I would have when you're thinking about the factors that affect price elasticity of supply is go back to the factors that affect price elasticity of demand and just figure out a way to kind of sort of substitute them out, because they're basically the same sorts of factors, especially things with like time horizon. When we say the breadth of the market for price elasticity of demand, we're talking about the breadth of the geographic market with price elasticity of supply. Substitutability and mobility of factor inputs is very similar to how substitutable your product is with price elasticity of demand. And of course, the amount of the input market that your product takes to produce is very similar to the price in relation to income for price elasticity of demand. So if you've really got your price elasticity of demand factors down, you can actually sort of stretch those into just working out the price elasticity of supply factors. And of course, because it is an elasticity calculation, it's always really good to have a number line here so you can interpret what these numbers mean. This one's easier than the cross price elasticity of demand or the income elasticity of demand, because like price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply is always one sign. It's always positive because the supply curve slopes upwards, and so therefore it's a positive relationship. So the price increases, we'll expect to see the quantity supplied increase. So it's always going to be a positive. So it's only between 0 and positive infinity. And it's very similar to the other ones, because if it's between 0 and 1, we say that's inelastic. That's the bottom heavy fraction where the percentage change in price changes proportionally more than the increase in quantity supplied. And so therefore the figure is below 1, between 0 and 1, that's inelastic or unresponsive. And so therefore if it's above 1, if it's between 1 and infinity, then we'd call it elastic, because the quantity supplies changes more than proportionally to the percentage change in price. Now, more important than being able to talk about the factors that affect it, or even being able to interpret what the numbers mean really, is going to be able to use this concept when you're doing some supply and demand analysis. And so now I'm going to show you how it is that you would use price elasticity of supply in a supply and demand context. So this, I think, helps explain why price elasticity of supply is useful. What it does is it just gives us a shape to our supply curve, right? So if we've got a product that we think is actually quite rare, quite difficult to produce, and so therefore unresponsive to price changes, we just draw like this. We'd say that it is a product which is inelastic in its supply, and so therefore it's quite a steep line up and down. It looks more like an I when we're looking at what the supply curve for that product looks like. Likewise, if we have a product which is actually quite easy to produce, quite responsive in its reaction to price changes, then we'd say that it's upward sloping, but it's quite sort of shallow in its gradient. So that's elastic supply. Remember, the elastic looks more like an E. And the reason why this is really useful is because then when we're doing our supply and demand analysis, if we put a demand curve on the one to the left, let's say that demand increases for some reason, then what we're going to see is that we have a new equilibrium with a much higher price, but not a very much higher quantity. And so that's useful for some reasons. for example, the reason why I think that you can interpret British house prices having gone up so much in the past 30 years is because the supply of housing is actually quite inelastic, primarily because it's difficult to get the planning permission, it's difficult to get everything together, and so therefore, despite massive increases in demand for housing in Britain, there hasn't actually been that much built, and so we've just seen astronomical price rises over the past 30 years. Likewise, if you wanted to do some analysis for a supply curve which is elastic, you start with a demand curve like this. The demand curve shifts right, and because it is a really responsive change in the quantity supplied to price changes, we have an elastic supply curve. We can see that there's not really very much change in the price, but we see we're able to really increase our quantity there. Again, this is useful as well because you want to look at the extremes. And for example, if you have a product which is perfectly inelastic in its supply, this is going to be something like, the Mona Lisa or maybe a Banksy artwork, or oftentimes you see these in auctions, right, where it's like something's going, some rare letter that somebody wrote long ago, and it gets these ridiculous prices because there's only one of them. And so the way you can analyze that is to say, well, oh yeah, and then of course you can also do the same thing with perfectly elastic supply, right? And we've seen why it is that things might be perfectly elastic in their supply before. And so with the first example, again, we have an equilibrium, price and quantity demanded, but if we increase our demand, then all that happens is we increase the price. The quantity demanded, the equilibrium quantity doesn't change because it can't, because there's only one thing in that market or something like that. Whereas with perfectly elastic supply, we can start with a demand curve and an equilibrium, and then if we shift our demand curve to the right, then we will see a big increase in quantity, but no increase in price, because of course the nature of the product means that we can just produce more of it, and that's why you can see an example of when the demand might shift to the right, but we don't actually see an increase in price. A valid reason would be to say that it's because possibly the product is perfectly elastic in its supply. So that's really it. The only thing I would recommend that you do is maybe look through and just make sure you've got this in notes. You can list what are the main factors that affect price elasticity of supply. Why will price elasticity of supply be higher in the long run than in the short run? Which is to say, why would supply be more elastic in the long run than the short run, which I think we looked at earlier in the video. Why would the price elasticity of supply of agricultural goods be lower than that of manufactured goods? Which is to say, why would agricultural goods be more inelastic in their supply than manufactured goods? I think that's a really interesting and useful one to know for context. And then, of course, this to say, why might price elasticity demand, so why might price elasticity of supply be zero, or why might it be infinity? Remember, zero means that it's perfectly inelastic, and infinity means that it's perfectly elastic. And so an example for zero might be, like we said, Mona Lisa or Banksy productions, whereas infinity is something which can be produced with constant marginal cost, or which is to say that you can just produce more of it without having to increase price. And so something like iTunes downloads might be a good example there. All right, well, that's that topic covered. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please make sure that you give the video a like, comment, and subscribe for more economics related content. I'll see you then. Bye.